In 1983, the fifth dimension, otherwise known as the Twilight Zone, entered the domain of the big screen in the TwilightZoneMovie, an ambitious movie produced by Steven Spielberg and John Landis, where the movie consists of 4 different segments, each being an individual story taking the viewer down a memorable trip into the Twilight Zone. Co-directed by Spielberg, Landis, Joe Dante and George Miller, and starring talents such as Dan Aykroyd and John Lithgow, the Twilight Zone movie should have been a sure hit, but sadly it was a movie steeped in tragedy and controversy. A movie of which its behind-the-scenes events would forever haunt this movie, in one of the most shocking incidents ever associated with a Hollywood film. So today, let's explore the Twilight Zone by looking into 10 things that you didn't know about the movie, although given the nature of the behind the scenes of this movie, some of them you might know, so we can respectfully understand its tragedy and see what happens when some of Hollywood's strongest movie-making talents join forces. Number 10. Origins of the movie. The idea of the Twilight Zone TV series being made into a movie had been around ever since the 60s, when the Twilight Zone was cancelled in 1964. The series host and creator Rod Serling had been trying to pitch the idea of a Twilight Zone movie, but without any luck, all the way up until the writer sadly passed away in 1975, where the project was scrapped and left to collect dust. Enter Steven Spielberg. In the early 80s, Spielberg was quickly becoming a powerhouse director, having directed Jaws, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And in the early 80s, Warner Brothers approached him about the possibility of him making a Twilight Zone movie. Having been a massive fan of the show, he jumped at the chance. Spielberg contacted his friend and fellow filmmaker John Landis to help to bring the Twilight Zone onto the big screen. Landis was also becoming a big-time director at that time, having directed Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and An American Werewolf in London. Spielberg and Landis would act as the movie's producers, with the movie being cut into 4 segments, with a prologue and first segment directed by Landis, the second segment directed by Spielberg, the third segment directed by Joe Dante, who had previously directed The Howling and would go on to direct Gremlins, and the fourth segment directed by George Miller, who previously directed Mad Max and its sequel, The Road Warrior. So all in all, it was an interesting and competent lineup of film directors. So with all these elements in place, it would seem that the Twilight Zone was set to be movie magic. However, disaster would strike, in what would become one of the most devastating events in movie history. Number 9. Tragedy on set. Yeah, there was no getting around the tragedy associated with the Twilight Zone movie. In fact, I would argue it's impossible to talk about this movie without bringing up the terrible accident that took place. Just Google Twilight Zone the movie and you'll be met with article after article of what happened while making this movie. The first segment of the Twilight Zone movie was an original story called Time Out, which unlike the other segments was not based on any previous episode of the Twilight Zone, where we follow a character called Bill Connor, played by Vic Morrow, who is a character intolerant towards other races and cultures, where one night he keeps slipping between different time zones of prejudiced monstrosities that have happened throughout history, for example, World War II. There was to be a scene where the character redeems himself by saving 2 Vietnamese children from a cavalry helicopter during the Vietnam War. Sadly, while filming this scene, due to pyrotechnics and the helicopter pilot losing control of the helicopter, both Morrow and the 2 child actors passed away. The event shocked the world as well as the movie-making industry. It instantly put a dark cloud over the Twilight Zone movie project and saw director John Landis in a lot of hot water. The incident changed and updated certain rules and regulations of filmmaking, and a notorious lawsuit followed where Landis and other members of the crew were facing criminal charges. In 1987, Landis and the other crew members were acquitted of manslaughter charges, but the damage was already done as 3 lives were sadly lost. Number 8. Intended segments. Lots of people comment that the irony of the Twilight Zone movie is that Spielberg's installment was the weakest part of the film, as you would think that he would have made the best segment given his credentials of making box office hits. Yes, the happy, whimsical story about elderly people in a retirement home becoming children for a night is based on an episode of the Twilight Zone TV series, but let's be honest, the Twilight Zone was more known for its thrilling, exciting, and scary episodes than it was its more wishy-washy magical ones. In fact, I would argue that the true show stealers of the Twilight Zone movie are Joe Dante, who directed the surreal It's a Good Life, and George Miller, who directed Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. Both segments perfectly capture a sense of excitement and chaos, and generally felt spectacular. So how did Spielberg get stuck with the boring, in comparison, kick the can segment? Well, sadly it goes back to the tragedy that took place. According to IMDb, which, let's be honest, sometimes isn't the most reliable source, Spielberg's segment was to be based on the episode The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which would have revolved around an alien invasion, something that would have seemed more fitting to Spielberg. But the segment would have involved child actors and tons of special effects, something that probably wasn't a good idea after what happened. There are claims that Spielberg was working on another story about a town bully who gets his comeuppances on the night of Halloween, but the story was dropped, so instead Spielberg took the more safe but mundane kick the can. Look, I don't think there's anything wrong with it per se, but to me it's just the weakest link, and slows the movie's excitement down, and it's the part of the movie I tend to skip whenever I watch the Twilight Zone movie. Number 7. Rod Serling cameo. Okay, now on to something more positive, that being the Twilight Zone's creator Rod Serling. As any Twilight fan would tell you, the original TV series was hosted and narrated by Serling. However, due to his passing in 1975, for the Twilight Zone movie, actor Burgess Meredith acted as the narrator, which is fitting as the actor starred in 4 different Twilight Zone stories in its original series run. However, that didn't stop Rod Serling from making an appearance in the movie from beyond the grave. Yeah, it's a blink and you'll miss it moment, but in the movie's recreated intro, Serling can be seen in the flying eye, paying a fitting tribute to the show's creator. If you haven't spotted it yet, then you'll have to keep an eye out for it. No, that wasn't meant to be a bad pun either. Sometimes the bad puns just write themselves. Number 6. Something scary. The Twilight Zone movie starts off with a prologue called Something Scary, which, as mentioned, was directed by John Landis, in which Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks are driving around a desert at night, where they start talking about old TV shows and thus the Twilight Zone series. We don't know who these characters are or why they are driving around in the desert at night, but I like to think it's Aykroyd and Brooks playing themselves, where Aykroyd tells Brooks to pull over because he has something scary to show him, where he literally turns into a monster zombie and seemingly kills Brooks. The scene is honestly terrifying and catches you off guard, and it often makes it onto lists of scariest moments in movies. I can specifically remember reading Empire magazine in 2004, yeah, I'm that old, where it had a list of scariest movie moments, where the Something Scary scene from the Twilight Zone was on the list. The list also included the clown doll attack from Poltergeist, Jason Voorhees' reveal in Friday the 13th, and the baby crawling on the ceiling from Trainspotting. So whoever came up with the list clearly knew their scary shit. Number 5. Novelization. So there was a novelization of the Twilight Zone movie, and just like the movie itself, its creation was a mess and dampened by the helicopter tragedy. The novelization was written by author Robert Bloch, aka the author who wrote the original Psycho novel. Yeah, you heard correctly. Bloch's novelization was based on an early screenplay of the movie that he was given, and all the segments in the book are out of order, as Kick the Can was meant to be the 4th segment, and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet was meant to be the 2nd one. His novelization also didn't contain the prologue or epilogue involving Dan Aykroyd's mischievous demon character, with Bloch claiming that no one informed him of those segments in the movie. Bloch was given a mere 6 weeks to write the book, while only being shown 2 segments of the movie. And to make matters worse, he had to quickly change the ending of the Time Out segment, as he wrote the original ending as intended, where the main character saves the 2 Vietnamese children from the helicopter. The ending in the book had to be changed due to the accident that took place. Yep, even the movie's novelization was somewhat doomed. Supposedly, Spielberg switched the segments around, making his and Landis' segments the first two, as he knew that they were the weakest segments in the movie. Number 4. Psycho soundtrack. The Twilight Zone movie's soundtrack was composed by movie scoring legend Jerry Goldsmith, and as you would expect, his score both pays homage to the original series, but also modernizes it with an 80s sound and adds synth in certain places, as well as making some truly magical melodies in some of the more heartfelt moments. However, considering there are 4 different segments, meant that Goldsmith had to do 4 individual movie scores, and apparently some of the music that was used for the Kick the Can segment was unused music that Goldsmith had previously composed for Psycho 2, of which the criminally underrated sequel came out the exact same year as the Twilight Zone movie. The irony is, composer Bernard Herrmann composed the original Twilight Zone theme for the TV series, as well as the theme for the original Psycho movie. By God, do you know what this means? It means the Twilight Zone is real and is controlling and guiding our every actions. Either that or it's all just one big coincidence. Number 3. Pop song. Yet we're not done talking about the music of the Twilight Zone movie yet, as the movie also had a pop song tie-in called Nights Are Forever by American singer Jennifer Warnes. The song was included in the movie's soundtrack and is heard in the movie at the start where the Bill character is at the bar with his friends. The song was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, and I always found its chorus to sound a little similar to the It's a Long Road song Goldsmith had also composed for First Blood 1 year earlier. There was, however, another pop song recorded for the Twilight Zone movie but incidentally never used, that being Anesthesia, which was by singer Joseph Williams, aka the son of movie composing legend John Williams. However, the song Anesthesia was added to the soundtrack in 2009 for its first compact disc release. Speaking of things rejected from the film, originally William Shatner was keen to reprise his role in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, as he had starred in the original TV version, but the part incidentally went to John Lithgow. Also, the actress who played Ethel, Anthony's supposed sister in the It's a Good Life sequence, is Nancy Cartwright, aka the voice of Bart Simpson. Number 2. Intended sequel. There was an intended sequel to follow the Twilight Zone movie, with more segments to be filmed, with a grand cinematic quality, with 4 new directors taking over. However, given the Twilight Zone movie wasn't the hit that everyone was hoping for, and was overshadowed by the controversy and tragedy of what happened, any plans for a sequel were scrapped. However, the Twilight Zone movie did somewhat spawn 2 TV shows, one of them being Amazing Stories, which was like the Twilight Zone of the 80s, an anthology series of all kinds of crazy and bizarre happenings, which could range from comical and goofy to downright horror movie terrifying. The series was created by Steven Spielberg himself, with him even directing a couple of the episodes, and ran for 2 seasons in 1985 and 1987. Speaking of Twilight Zone of the 80s, the other show that spawned from the Twilight Zone movie literally was Twilight Zone of the 80s, as a revived series was broadcast, which, like Amazing Stories, also started in 1985 and lasted 2 seasons. The show was revived again in 2002, and more recently in 2019 with Jordan Peele. Not to mention the fact that the Twilight Zone would influence other TV shows and still continues to do so. For example, Black Mirror. Number 1. Failings. The Twilight Zone movie was released in late June 1983, and as you would imagine, more people were talking about the controversial deaths associated with the movie than the movie itself. The Twilight Zone movie made $29 million on a $10 million budget, which is incredibly lower than anticipated, especially considering it was a Spielberg production. I can remember hearing a few years ago that at the time there was a cartoon drawing in a newspaper which showed the Twilight Zone movie at a movie theatre of which was empty, and next door was the trial that took place over the tragedy of the Twilight Zone movie, to which people were lining up in droves to see it. Sadly, I think that demonstrates the Twilight Zone movie. No matter how good or bad it was, it'll always be tainted by the tragedy of what happened. The movie could have been a masterpiece, and yet it still would have had that dark cloud over it. The Twilight Zone movie had, without a doubt, a tragic production. However, it was still unique in that it saw an anthology TV show turned into an anthology movie, with the gathering of the biggest filmmakers of its time, where movie audiences got to go to the Twilight Zone. But when judging the movie as a movie and leaving the behind the scenes aside, it's okay. I mean, it's not spectacular, it's okay. But I will say that the last two segments by Joe Dante and George Miller are superb, and it's worth checking out the movie for those two segments alone. To me, the Kick the Can segment is boring, and the Out of Time segment does have some great ideas and messages, but yeah, still tainted by what happened. Maybe, had the tragedy never taken place, then the Twilight Zone could have been a better film, but we'll never know. Anyway, I'm Minty, and rest in peace, Vic Morrow and the two child actors. See ya!